Well, I realize that the phrase Happy New Year always resonates with a certain irony your first day back, but welcome back anyway. I at least had a wonderful vacation. By the way, I did have a Forest Service permit to do that. Tori says hi. I even had some new experiences. And as some of you would know, if you checked your email, I'm still looking for a name for our family's newest art acquisition, which is the metal Triceratops. The person posing next to it is my daughter. She actually already has a name. Anyway, vacation is now over, and it's back to art history. Now, if you're wondering what great piece of Renaissance art I decided to begin with, this is Michelangelo's grocery list. Honest. It was displayed in an exhibit of Michelangelo's papers at the Seattle Art Museum. And this is what the program said about this artifact. I quote, "Because the servant he was sending to market was illiterate, Michelangelo illustrated the shopping lists. A herring, tortelli, 2 fennel soups, 4 anchovies, and a small quarter of rough wine." So here we have the true Renaissance man, interested in everything, including getting a good meal. I just note that if my family had to rely on a Mary McConnell-generated illustrated grocery list to figure out what to buy, we would all starve. Well, this unit covers slightly less than 2 chapters and will never leave Italy. Yet it may well be the densest and frankly the most demanding unit of the course. You'll encounter many of the biggest names in art history, every single Ninja Turtle, and plenty more artists besides. You will have to recognize many of their works by sight. You'll have to recognize many of their works by name, as well as where and when, or at least in what century they were painted. Let me note, by the way, that I have already written your test and prepared all of your oral essay questions, so I have a pretty good sense of what the College Board is going to throw at you. I'll try to keep that in mind as I go through the lectures, but this is a difficult unit. I thought that when I reviewed the past AP questions. Let me make one other note about the test, because I don't know that it says this in your assignment sheet. We're not going to do the basic simple PowerPoints, but instead we're going to do, again, the oral essay questions. And I'm hoping to be able to participate via FaceTime, but I will try to exercise a little more self-control in my jabbering on this time. I am also going to ask you to submit the essay via Turnitin.com and to write a second draft. As we get closer to the AP exam, you need more practice writing essays. This is just one paragraph, although it should be a nice, juicy, detailed paragraph. I don't know that it says that on the assignment sheet, but that will be the expectation. Ms. Jacobs will give you more information, and you don't have to worry about that yet. We have a lot of material to get through before we get to any essay questions. Anyway, it's going to be an exhilarating ride. I think you're going to love the Italian Renaissance, but it's going to be a lot of work. So I recommend that you fasten your seatbelt and prepare for a few weeks of pretty intense study. Hope you rested up over vacation. For today, though, you get a break. You'll notice that Ms. Jacobs did not hand out the PowerPoints you're seeing on the screen, and that was deliberate. Today, you get to sample a tasting menu, an introduction to the extraordinary world that emerged in 15th century Italy, and more specifically in the city of Florence. Tonight and tomorrow, the hard work begins. Now, most modern histories of Europe begin here, in this city, at the dawn of the 15th century. So the question I want you to begin thinking about today is why? What was it about Florence that spawned and attracted so many great artists? What was it about this moment in history that produced both a classical revival and, perhaps even more importantly, a burst of innovation? I hope and really trust that you will not succumb to the simplistic judgment that the Renaissance Italians themselves made about previous generations. They thought they had reclaimed civilization from the barbarians, or as they dubbed them, the Goths, named after some of the tribes that invaded the Roman Empire. Okay, this is not the art of a primitive culture. Neither is this, and neither is this. For that matter, this is not the art of a culture that placed no value on humanity or that failed to value at least some elements of the classical tradition. So again, it's a mistake to exaggerate the break, significant as it was. At the same time, even though we are much too awed by cathedrals and stained glass windows to label the entire Middle Ages as barbaric, we still need to understand that something did happen in Florence, and further that something did represent a huge shift in human history and in the history of art. For the remainder of this class, we're going to share 3 slightly different video interpretations of the origins of the Renaissance. You may not have time to finish the last clip, by the way. I hope you finish watching it at home and maybe check out some of the other in this 4-part series on the Medici. I may very well include bits and pieces of at least in following lectures. There is a wealth of video material on this. I'm going to have to pick and choose. So let's begin with my favorite art historian, or one of my favorite art historians, as she takes us to Florence. Okay, now that you've watched this video clip, let me ask, what misperception about the Renaissance is Sister Wendy trying to head off? And I'm not talking about the barbarians, but she doesn't come right out and say it, but she is anticipating a common misunderstanding about the Renaissance. What do you think it is? Well, the Renaissance was not a rebellion against religion. There are few more religious ages, and much of the art we're going to view is clearly religious, both in its subject matter and in its motivation. In fact, I'm not sure this comes out in any of the videos, but one of the things, but we talked about it when we talked about the Arena Chapel. The town dwellers of the Renaissance were deeply religious, but they were also worried about their status. Their entire economy was based on trade, and trade required banks, capital, and money lending, something that the church looked on with deep suspicion at this point in its history. So there's an element of proving themselves to the world, to God, to the church, but it was certainly not a retreat from religion. But as Sister Wendy asserts, the Renaissance did elevate the importance of human creation, of humans as God's creation, and of things that human beings could create themselves. The idea that God made man in his image with some of his creative powers was an idea that resonated very strongly in the Renaissance. And in particular, we see a very striking reevaluation of the role of the talented individual artist. This video clip ended with the great patron family, the Medici, but Sister Wendy doesn't actually directly tackle what I think is a very important question. Why did Florence's merchant culture give rise to such a vast expansion in patronage? And why did these patrons seek out and foster individual geniuses, such as Masaccio, Fra Angelico, and Michelangelo? Let's turn to a second video to begin exploring this question. This is from The Art of the Western World. It's a real short clip. So I wanted you to think about the role that economic competition played in the Renaissance. Why don't you talk about this for just a minute, and then I will resume. Well, it's interesting to note that economic historians sometimes describe this period, actually really the period toward the end of the Renaissance, although I would argue that it really begins earlier in Florence, as the commercial revolution. This was a period when money reappeared on a large scale. I mean, the Roman Empire had a working money supply, coinage, but the Middle Ages operated largely on barter, and there was, in fact, very little economic growth between the fall of the Roman Empire and the Renaissance and the commercial revolution. You had money change hands, you had wealth change hands, but there was not much expansion in wealth. And actually, that's a little inaccurate. There was an expansion of wealth in the High Middle Ages and a contraction during the 14th century, but it was, in economic terms, a somewhat stagnant period. But in this period, the Italian Renaissance, and particularly the High Renaissance era, money reappeared on a large scale. Banks were founded. And these banks, in turn, financed further economic expansion. By the way, the church played a very important role in it because it was a huge economic enterprise. And one of the most important inventions of the late Middle Ages was actually double entry bookkeeping, which made it much easier to manage large-scale economic organizations. But during this period, trade expanded first within the Mediterranean, and many of the Italian fortunes that financed this art were based on trade with the Near East, trade in the Mediterranean. And in fact, part of the decline in Italy would come when Spain, Portugal, and England began, using, by the way, often Italian inventions. Christopher Columbus, of course, was an Italian, to move into the Far East and into the New World, which eclipsed Italy. But that's getting way ahead of our story. And Italy was ahead of the story of the commercial revolution. In many ways, this is where it began. So in just a minute, you're going to be watching our final video clip, which follows the rise of the Medici family as bankers, civic leaders, and patrons of the arts. But first, let me pose a question. What does it say about a society that it would hold a competition to award two extremely important commissions? The baptistry doors, which you've just heard about and seen, and which are portrayed here, and we're going to talk about a lot tomorrow, and the dome over the Florence Cathedral, which you're going to be seeing in just a minute. Well, maybe it's my training in economics. I should note that the other course I inflict on Juan Diego students online is economics. But I think that along with the rediscovery of ancient texts, the rise of a merchant class that lived and breathed competition was an extraordinarily important impetus for humanism. There was some social mobility during the Middle Ages, but for the most part, people were expected and expected themselves to stay in the social class to which they were born. The ruling elite was a noble class that basically held power because of its warrior status and guarded entry into its ranks. And almost everyone, peasants, priests, and nobles, viewed the upstart town dwellers with suspicion, except in the Italian city-states, or more accurately, some of the Italian city-states, which founded republics when the merchant class seized political power and began reshaping culture in its own image. So, on to the Medici.